of the Robert Jackson Center, and this is the 7th, as David indicated, International Humanitarian Law Dialogue. And what a thrill to have this amazing assemblage of people who are involved in the international criminal law world, which of course is to us a direct legacy from Justice Robert H. Jackson. And we're just thrilled. And I don't know that we've actually paused to do this, David, but let me do so, is for the students here to know who's in this group. It's a who's who. And let me just rifle them off, and if you just stand, we're not going to applaud every one of you, just stand so they can know who's here in our group. I mean, it's a big deal.
I'll go ahead.
I'm just a transactional lawyer from Jamestown, New York, and I'm so honored to have this assemblage here to honor Robert Jackson at the Robert Jackson Center and to do such great work. But we have Fatou Bensouda, the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And you know how well they listen when I said, don't go out there. Go ahead, she deserves it. I don't know if this guy does, but Serge Brammer from the International Criminal Court. Direct line from Cambodia, Andrew Cayley. David Crane, our chairman of the already. From the ICTR, Hassan Jallo. Journey to Justice, just coming out now. In fact, he's going to really roll it out seriously in Atlanta this week, right?
Yes.
Yes. And Ambassador Stephen Rapp from Sierra Leone. Those are our group of prosecutors, and I commend you. I was going to go through the balance of the invited speakers and panelists, but we never get to where we really want to get to tonight. Little background. David Crane, we have meetings once a month, suggested that we're a Sunday night. Of course, the highlight is the Heinz Award. And last year we had the privilege of having a group in the interview with those people involved in the Charles Taylor trial. And I thought it went very, very well. And I suggested to David maybe we could do something similar. And he suggested His Royal Highness Prince Zeid. Now, I must tell you, we've had a lot of interviews here with Chief Justices of the United States, governors, senators, and prosecutors, people who are involved in very high office, solicitor generals, attorney generals, U.S. attorneys like William Hochul, who's here. These are all really big deals, but I've never had the privilege to say that tonight I'm going to have a chance to interview His Royal Highness. So, thank you very much for that. So, David and I were having this conversation, and he said, gee, why don't we have a chance to interview His Royal Highness Prince Zeid, ambassador from Jordan to the United Nations? And I said, great. And David said, no, it's perfect. It is perfect. Now, I did a little biographical research to prepare for tonight. And you must know that Jamestown, New York, many of you have never been here before, is very much a Swedish community. My name is Greg Peterson. And if you hadn't read the bio closely, you would know that Prince Zeid's mother is Swedish, born Margareta Inga Elizabeth Lind. It doesn't get any more Swedish than this. And so I thought of no other better gift to introduce Prince Zeid to us, to the Jackson Center, and more importantly, to Jamestown, than this shirt, which I am glad to give to you. It reads, not only am I perfect, I'm Swedish too. Here, get a picture of this. Your mother would be so proud.
She would be. She would be.
I told you this was not going to be your normal interview. We have not rehearsed this at all. You need to know that his favorite sport is rugby. And who do you root for now? Now that you're a high-end ambassador, world figure, who do you applaud for?
Yeah, I used to, well, I don't watch it anymore, but I used to root for France. I used to love the way they played the game. Very attacking, very stylish, skillful, and that's a team I used to root for, I think, the most.
Do you play? Just pick up?
No. No, I had a motorcycle accident 2 years ago, and in actual fact, I had to give my deposition because I filed a lawsuit against the well-known pizza delivery company that crashed into me, and so they have utterly removed any possibility of me going back to playing rugby, unless I can wear a helmet. No.
Where was this accident?
No, I've already retained counsel. And you'd be too expensive for me.
This guy is really good. This might be very tough. Do you know what kind of pizza they were delivering? I mean, did you get to that level? Is this part of the deposition? Was this a pepperoni special?
Not answering.
We're at the Robert Jackson Center, and I just have to get this question out. We're at the Robert Jackson Center, and I know you've written extensively about your intimate role in the creation of the International Criminal Court. What does a Robert Jackson mean to Prince Zeid?
It means you can get somewhere in law without ever having gone to law school, which is precisely what happened to me. Of course, when you hear someone speak, not just so thoughtfully, and his opening statement is well known to people the world over, but it was through his use of language, an exquisite use of language, which you find even perhaps more inspiring today than others would have found, or those who would have heard him at the time would have felt, simply because we don't hear people speak like that anymore. Not even, outstanding lawyers, I mean, with exceptions. And I think the way he couched the case was extraordinary, because there was criticism of the IMT at the time. It was not an easy endeavor to get it up and running. And I think in his opening statement, he provided the foundation for what he was able to accomplish later on. One understands that, yes, of course, during the course of the trial, he made some mistakes, and he compensated for them by using methods which would be very familiar to us now, but maybe at the time were not well established. And so like that, he was breaking new ground. But really, if you think of the tribunal, you think of Robert H. Jackson and how it was really the fulcrum on which world events were shaped.
Are you able to see sort of a direct line from the London Agreement, which was really, Jackson was very much part of the architect of that agreement, which created the protocol for the Nuremberg trial, the actual prosecution of the trial pursuant to that Nuremberg Agreement, and what goes on today at the International Criminal Court, what goes on in Rwanda, Yugoslavia? Do you see a legacy there?
Yeah, there is one, but it's a very difficult circumstance that we deal with now, because in effect, when Germany was destroyed, the Germans themselves did not engage deeply with what was going on at the IMT and the 12 subsequent trials and the Allied run trials. It was really only around 1965 that the Germans themselves had to deal with it, because Adenauer, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, Adenauer was not keen to proceed soon after the end of the war with a German reckoning of German crimes, or German reckoning of Nazi crimes. And so there was a space that psychologically was given the Germans in one way, until you got to the point where the statute of limitations were running out on the two categories under the 1871 Penal Code. And then finally the Germans had to, with the Auschwitz-Frankfurt trial, had to come to terms themselves with what it was they had done. In the case of the International Criminal Court, we don't have this sort of postponement in effect. And you're not yourself taking control over the country. You're not basically, you don't have a trusteeship where you could basically put in place what you want and what you need right away, notwithstanding whatever the people may think. And so you have now a much more complicated situation, because we believe that there needs to be accountability, and it has to be, these proceedings must begin as early as possible. In many respects, these countries are nowhere near ready to deal with these issues. And we've seen this, and the prosecutors here, who are all here, know this far better than I do. And so we need to sort of be, while supporting this endeavor completely, we need to sort of keep a critical eye on how we can improve the efficacy of what it is that we're trying to do. And so there is a direct link, but in some way, the experience of the International Military Tribunal was, or rather the conduct of the proceedings was not as fraught with the challenges that I think one experiences today in many parts of the world where we have crimes on a massive scale being committed. So I've totally avoided your question, I think, somehow.
We're going to stick with our line here. It's just, to me, it's much easier. It's a direct line to every one of you here. Great. You played such a major role in the establishment of the ICC. You were elected the first president of the governing body of the International Criminal Court and oversaw a lot of its growth in the following 3 years. And you also chaired the complex negotiation on the elements of the individual offenses. Talk about that whole negotiation process where you get a whole group of people in a room and you're working semantics of just coming up with the elements of the crime.
Well, I must acknowledge Professor Mike Newton, because he was in the group with me, and Herman van Hebel, who is the current registrar of the ICC, was chairing the working group, and I was chairing the informal negotiations. Now, I think what was so amazing to me is realizing that, and contrary to what most people believe, it's not simply just a case of states negotiating a particular text and then coming to an agreement. There were two things that came to my mind very quickly. One is that there's a tremendous amount of technique that you as a coordinator or a chairperson can develop and learn from others who have far more experience than you. That it's not anyone or everyone who can do this. Others will have done this, and then you learn from them, and you have to use those techniques to try and forge an agreement. The second is that so much depends on personality. You can have the same countries represented in the room. We were about, I think, 60 to 80 who were negotiating the elements for the offenses that fall under the Rome Statute. And you could have replaced all of them with a different set, and we may never have reached an agreement in the end. And so the personalities themselves very much were decisive in this. And I think throughout the whole experience, and of course, Professor Sharif Bassouni was with us before Rome and during Rome, and I think he can also attest to this. And we were extremely lucky. We were lucky in Rome, and we were lucky after Rome that we had the right sort of people and the right sort of mix to get through this. And the breakthrough came when the US, together with Switzerland, provided a sort of a basic template for how we were going to deal with the three categories of elements, the and we had to also get our head around a particular article in the general part of the statute, Article 30, on mens rea, and fully understand how the elements fit in with the general intent, and that we were really dealing with the exceptions and general intent provisions, and we were dealing with the exceptions, and then once we got the structure down, it started to come into place, basically.
2009, there was a gathering which talked about that which Robert Jackson, back to Jackson, during the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, called the crime of aggression as the supreme international crime. Maybe for some of the students, that concept, the definition, is still in play. Could you explain a little bit where that stands?
No, we have nailed the definition, and I think we came to an agreement on the definition more or less before we went to the review conference in Kampala. And essentially, we borrowed from the General Assembly Resolution 3314 and converted what was a sort of a definition agreeable to a UN General Assembly resolution, and basically had to customize it so that it would fit into a penal code. It wasn't as difficult initially as we thought it was going to be. Once we understood that we had to balance it out very carefully between the interests of the permanent members of the Security Council and the rest of the membership. But that was quite easy in comparison to the negotiations we had to conduct on the grounds for the exercise of jurisdiction, and the method by which the changes had to be negotiated, because there were two paths toward having the amendment in place, and they seemed to be mutually exclusive, and so we had to work around that issue.
Just for the students out there, you talked about Sharif Bassioni. He was there before, during, and after. I just want everybody to know that he's one of the senior members here, but he was not there at the fall of Rome. So disabuse yourself of that, Sharif. Right? That's right. Some people were wondering. Just had to clear that up. This is now much more important. Talk to me about Jon Stewart. You had an opportunity extraordinaire to be interviewed by Jon Stewart in The Daily Show. What was that all about?
Well, I think you're funnier than he was. But now I've guaranteed that I'll never be invited back on his show. Yeah, I mean, he's a very funny guy, and you sit in front of him and he just makes you laugh without him even having to say anything. And so, that was fun. I enjoyed it.
What was the context for those who, I did see it on YouTube, what was the context that you were there to be invited to the Jon Stewart show?
It was last minute. His Majesty the King was invited to speak on the show and to introduce this book that he had only recently just completed, and he was basically going to sell the book. I hadn't read the book, and so I was told...
I love those spokespeople, you know?
So I was told 2 days or 3 days before the show was shot, I was told that I had to go, and the King couldn't come, so I had to go instead, and I had to peddle the book. So I got a copy of the book, and I read it twice. I skimmed it first time, and then I read it in detail, and I made all sorts of notes. And I arrive at the studio, and I'm all ready to talk about the book. And the producer said, he's not going to ask you about the book. He wants to ask you about what's been happening in the Middle East over the last 2 or 3 days. And I said, but I don't know anything. I've just been reading the book. I haven't been watching the news. I've just been reading the book. And so that was the quandary I was in. I leave it to the judgment of the viewers whether I did an okay job.
Did he talk to you beforehand? Like we had such a long discussion, about 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, he said he was furious. He'd never been invited to the Robert H. Jackson Center.
He's good. He's good. When you get done, do you go back to the green room and do you kind of kibitz with Stewart?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
No. You know what he does is that the show is shot at 6 o'clock. And, you know, his stock and trade is to take one of us public officials and get you to sing. And he'll ask you to do all the, you know, throw these soft lobs. And he'll say something like, you know, so how is the situation in Jordan? And then so I would sit there and say, well, it's very good, peaceful, quiet, calm, you know, all of this sort of thing. And then the show is broadcast, I think, at 11. So between 7 o'clock and 11, they're rummaging through all these newsreels, looking for footage of a Jordanian policeman beating the life out of someone. And here the ambassador saying, you know, it's all quiet and peaceful. And the background utterly exposed. And that's his stock and trade. So I was very careful about how I responded, I think.
You wrote an article, this goes back a few years, called Dealing with, at the American Society of International Law, Betsy and Company, dealing with peace versus justice, contradictory or complementary, in which you sort of started with in April of 1995 with Richard Goldstone in the International Criminal Tribunal at Yugoslavia, and deal sort of with this whole issue of peace versus justice. Again, we have a lot of students here. Can you sort of synthesize your views on that process and whether it's even changed since you made this presentation in 1995? If you don't remember it, I got it here.
Yeah, no, it's quite old. When I was in the former Yugoslavia, we reached a point where we had been negotiating for so long with the various sides that it really felt that it felt a useless exercise, a pointless exercise. I mean, to a certain extent, when you see now the need or the desire by a number of governments to convene, and I should be careful here that I'm speaking only on a personal basis, convene a sort of second round or Geneva II talks over Syria. It's sort of reminiscent of what we went through in the former Yugoslavia in 1994 with the contact group plan. It was the last in a series of plans to bring about peace, and really there was no reason to believe that the warring sides had exhausted themselves, and that they would want to strike a deal at that stage. But there was still this, in the absence of anything else, we still felt we had to talk, and suddenly there was this man, Richard Goldstone, and he said he was going to investigate 3 Bosnian Serb leaders, and there was panic that spread throughout the UN. Well, if he indicts them, will we be able to talk to them? And if we can't talk to them, how are we going to bring an end to the fighting? And then he did indict them after Srebrenica, and the panic ensued, and people were furious with him. But in the end, the indictments, they forced us to think differently. We couldn't deal with them anymore. Something had to change. And the something that had to change was that in the event that there was a new development, a new marketplace bombing, that we were not just going to sit there idly and just note it down and report to the Security Council, but the UN was going to turn the key. There was a dual key arrangement with NATO for airstrikes. The UN would turn the key, and this, in fact, then happened at the end of August 1995, and then we had a process whereby it led to the end of the fighting. Now, it can be argued that the conflict still exists in Bosnia, that it never really went away. The fighting has ended in 1995. And so we must, I think very deeply about what it is that is required to ensure that you do move from a situation of an absence of fighting to true peace and lasting peace.
At that time, Goldstone became really the first chief prosecutor of an international tribunal with the ICTY, and then Carlo Del Ponte and Luis Arbor, and now Serge Brammertz. You want to talk about Serge?
Hey, he's a great guy. Where is Serge? He's a good friend. And I say that because I know he says the same about me, so it's reciprocal.
That was a posted question by Serge. Right over there, right over there. Recently, you had a chance to speak at the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life. Don Ferencz was part of that, and Don will be piping us in for dinner tomorrow, which will be good. And they state here that you argued in that speech at Brandeis that the rule of law is essential to make humanity whole following crimes committed against it, but law is not enough. What is?
I think I said it far more eloquently than that. You've butchered my lecture.
No, it's not a quote. It's just it's a report. And I think it was Don Ferencz. See the picture, Don.
Look at that. You got it off the internet.
It's not you. It's Don.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
I'll send it to you. What I tried to argue is that I think ending impunity is not enough. It's not enough that we just punish people. We have to somehow make them see what it is that they have done. Most of the people, I mean, all of us have come to accept that few of the people who perpetrate these crimes are pathologically of a sort where you can say they're sadists, or they enjoy participating in the commission of crimes. The vast majority of people, it would seem to be, are normal people who are presented with extraordinary circumstances and then who commit these crimes. And yet, with very, very few exceptions, since 1945, no one is prepared to show any remorse for them. No one. And so we lock them away, or post the Holocaust and events, of course, in Japan. Many were hanged, and yet hardly a single one climbing the steps up to the gallows ever showed any contrition or remorse, or ever believed that they were anything but innocent. And so there's something missing in this puzzle. And I think we need to discuss it. And just punishing them is not enough. We have to make them say, I am guilty of the most terrible crimes. And I'm saying it not because I need a plea bargain, or I want to be excused from prosecution, or I am saying it because given the weight of evidence presented before me, what I did was terrible. And unless victims hear this, there's something missing. And I tried to present this case in the lecture that you've destroyed, basically, in your introduction.
I clearly did. What advice, obviously there's so much going on in the Middle East, in case you missed it while you were reading other books. Some things going on in Egypt, we'll bring you up to speed afterwards. And obviously a lot going on in Syria, and conversation going on in both locations regarding even the crimes, the potential prosecution of international war crimes. What advice are you giving that you could talk about here as to what sort of tribunal, let's use Syria as an example, if in fact we were to capture Assad, and there's been various tribunals, most of them represented right here. We've got permanent, we've got hybrids, we've got everything humanly possible. What would be a model which you would see given that scenario where, let's say, Assad was arrested tomorrow?
You've been talking to Stephen Rapp because you asked me the same question at dinner.
No.
Yes,
Steve,
you have.
did we talk?
Yes, you have. Yes, you have. This is a stage question. Can I lie? Yeah, you're putting. I have a job and I have a wife and children. You're going to get me thrown out of this.
This will not go on YouTube tomorrow.
Well, I can see the camera there. I think we have to. I mean, I'll be talking about this hopefully tomorrow. So I don't want to undercut my own delivery. tomorrow. But what we need to do, I think, is very carefully balance out the interests of seeing justice done with the rhythms of a society which may need their own sort of imprint on this. And I think we have maybe taken too hard a position, although I think we need to constantly and very passionately defend the Rome Statute. I said that sometimes we just need to find the spaces and the right path into a particular society. I mean, the Syrians, like the Iraqis before them, and I remember when Pierre Prosper, Stephen's predecessor, returned from Iraq. I think he was probably with Sharif Bassouni. They were working on the war crimes statute for Iraq. When he came back to New York, I had a meeting with him, and I said, "So, Pierre, how is it in Iraq? You know, how do they view accountability?" And he said, "Well, for them, it's really two options, and they want the answers to these two options that they see are the only two courses available to them. You know, can they hang 22,000 people if they can't hang 5,000 people?" And so the thirst for retribution and revenge would be very great, and we have to work in accountability in whatever method is desirable to them and to the international community satisfies us, whereby justice in a broader sense is attained, and the truth in a broader sense also comes out. I mean, the sad thing about the Iraq case is, yes, we've seen a number of people, senior Ba'athists, tried, but the Iraqis still don't know how to deal with their history, with their memory. What occasions do they celebrate? What do they commemorate? What don't they commemorate? Who are they in the broader sense? 29 ethnic groups, how do they fit in? And how does it all tie into memory? And perhaps, you know, cases have been tried, but the deeper questions still remain. And perhaps we can learn from that and see with Syria and not repeat our mistakes. But it may be some time before we get to a Syria where it's stable enough so that trials can be conducted.
You're a rock star in that whole international criminal law world. You're looked to for sage advice. You are...
Are you saying I'm on drugs or something?
No. You're a go-to person. I'm always curious. You got your BA from Johns Hopkins University, PhD from Cambridge. But was there an aha moment where you decided that you would, in fact, cast your professional and lot in this international criminal law world, to create a consciousness, a discussion? Was there a moment in time that kicked you into that gear?
There were two moments. I think the primer came when we were in the former Yugoslavia. I was part of a team. We were shuttling between Pale and Sarajevo at the end of 1995, soon after Jimmy Carter had come to Bosnia to see whether he could cement a ceasefire on the back of what we normally at the time called winter ceasefires. It would snow, there'd be little fighting, and he'd try and build on that. So President Carter came, he managed to win sort of a basic commitment to a ceasefire, and then we began to shuttle back and forth between Pale and Sarajevo to cement the ceasefire. And one evening when we were driving back from Pale, a well-known figure in the former Yugoslavia, who was subsequently indicted, drove for war crimes, drove up next to us, and he had put the head of a small Bosnian child on the bonnet of the car with a UN helmet over it, and we saw lots of things when we were there, and even if in a court of law someone were to explain to you why and what it was done for, at least in a sort of basic academic sense, nothing really can fully explain when you see it. There doesn't seem to be any argument that can justify, the sorts of things that one sees in the case of war. After that, I had left the UN and joined the permanent mission. And my uncle, Prince Hassan, or Crown Prince Hassan at the time, called me up, and he's a very close friend of Sharif's. And Sharif must have invited him to attend a meeting on international criminal law in Malta. And he couldn't go, so he called me up and he said, I'd like you to go instead. And I said to him, but I don't know anything about this. I don't know. I have no background in this. And the more I complained, the more he insisted that I go. He didn't tell me that the closing panel is something that I would be chairing. So I turn up to hear Sharif speak with all the authority that he has about these issues. And I was shaking like a leaf, thinking, what on earth can I say? I'm a complete imposter. I have no clue. And I think I must have passed off as that. And so some people must have thought, poor fellow, we'll give him a second chance. And they invited me to continue working on this file.
What's the question that we haven't asked tonight that you get asked the most? What am I missing here?
People would say to me in the US, what advice would you give to President Obama or President Bush before him if you could sit with them and talk about the Middle East? That's the most common question.
If you had a chance to sit with President Obama, let's just say for an hour, just you and he over a brewski, what would you say?
The first thing I'd say is talk to me, always. I think the most important lesson is to understand that much of what we see are permutations of developments that we've seen before in world history, that these are not so unique. They are unique, but not so unique that we can't derive lessons from the past. And I think there are too many world leaders who are not interested really in understanding that, who don't have historians around them, who maybe don't read as much history as they should. And you find that most professional historians write for professional historians. And it's a very sad state of affairs, because I think one has to remain sort of attuned to these complex developments as they happened in the past, and then derive the right lessons from them. And much of what we see, I've said this earlier tonight, that we next year will commemorate the centenary of the start of the First World War. There's been a profusion of new books that have been published, and now there's a book due to be published soon, which I think would be very important. And I think we need to have international conferences on that topic alone, simply because the events in 1914 and then leading forward really shaped the rest of the century and still shape events today. I mean, when you hear that the Kurds within the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, led by Masoud Barzani, are forming stronger ties by the day with the PYD and the Kurds in northern Syria, it's an outcome of the fact that the powers at Versailles decided, I think very deliberately, that the Kurdish nation was not going to enjoy its own state at the time. And here we are 100 years later, and we still see the effects of it and how it can affect the neighboring sensitivities, whether it be Iran, or whether it be Turkey, and Syria, and so forth. And so these events they take years for the pressures to build, and then you have a sudden decompression. And I think we're coming up to one again in the Middle East and beyond. And unless we feel somehow we're far superior to our predecessors in disentangling them and then working out remedies for them, and which I'm sure we don't, then what hope do we have that we are better able to handle them than they were at that time? I mean, I find it striking, for instance, when I get all these assessments from various firms that supply Wall Street with analyses. And I remember in July of 2012, I saw some articles about the Cypriot banks. And then they all but disappeared until you got to the moment the banks were on the brink of insolvency. And then suddenly everyone started to talk about them again. And I thought, what, no one noticed this? I mean, all these people who paid these vast sums and no one noticed this? And then you notice, for instance, many of them who provide these assessments, and governments rely on them. It's amazing because you see them, they give you 5 pages, and each story comes in a little box. They have something about the economic crisis in Brazil, and then something about India, the labor market there being affected, something about Syria, something. And all the boxes are of equal size. And it just seems insane, because they're not all equivalent in terms of the effects that they could have in terms of shaping our future. And why do we give them an equivalency? Some are, I think, have a bare gravity that's in excess of all the rest combined, and we don't see it. You know, a lot of analysts who really don't analyze properly. So, not to be flippant about it, but I would say to various heads of state, you know, spend a lot of time keeping up to date on what historians are digging up and showing us about our understanding of previous or past developments.
This is more of a personal curiosity. You wrote an article back in '94 which talked about the Suez Canal and the nightmare avoided. Could you briefly summarize what that was about, and is that relevant today? Because you hear about the Suez Canal, and it's making sure that continues to be a open, viable thing.
Yeah, the nightmare. It was Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, who used that word in describing the quandary that he was in, because, very simply put, Jordan and the Great Britain or the United Kingdom had a defensive alliance, that if Jordan were to be attacked at any stage, that the United Kingdom would come to our aid. When it dawned on the British, as they were beginning to collude with the French on seizing the canal, that the Israelis already had advanced planning on it, Operation Kadesh. Eden, I think, began to realize the complexity of the situation he was in, because at one stage, Moshe Dayan, I think it was the 12th or 13th of October 1956, said to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion that before there is any prosecution of a war against Egypt, there should first be a seizure of the West Bank, because strategically it would make more sense for the Israelis not to have that flank exposed. 3 or 4 days after that, the French foreign minister mentioned to Prime Minister Ben-Gurion that if the Israelis were indeed to take that particular position and seize the West Bank then, that it would invite a British reaction, and that the British, together with Jordan at the time, had already advanced planning in the works over the bombing of certain Israeli sites, Haifa in the north, Eilat in the south, and so forth. And so Anthony Eden was caught in this amazing position, which perhaps only a British Prime Minister could find themselves in, and that was that at one and the same time, they would be allies and working with the Israelis in prosecuting a war against Egypt, and at the same time attacking the Israelis because the Israelis had attacked Jordan. And so this was the nightmare that Eden had to try and avoid, basically.
What's next for you? I mean, other than John Stewart, reading books, kind of catching up on what's going on in the Middle East. What's new? What's next for you?
Well, I turned up here in the mistaken belief that I actually won the Heinz Humanitarian Award. Because it wasn't clear in the invitation. And so I sent a note to David, and I said, David, I'm very proud. My mother's very happy. My children are very proud. But I really don't know what I've done in a humanitarian sense to have warranted this or merited this. Now, quietly to myself, I always knew that I deserved it for something, but I couldn't say so. And then he said to me, well, actually, it's not for you. It's for someone else. So I suppose I have to come back and win it at some stage. Yeah.
Well, I knew that you were upset. I knew you were upset, but I wanted to make sure you walked away with something to make your mother proud.
She will.
And I'm so proud and so thrilled that, you came, you joined us, you're going to present us with a speech, and for me to have the opportunity to say thank you, His Royal Highness. This is great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
My mother will be proud.
Okay, everybody, please, if you came on the bus, please return on the bus. For those that arrived from the airport late, please board the big bus. I think your luggage has been placed on it. Now, the most important piece of information that I had to give you, on that bus going back with you to the hotel will be Kathy. But under Kathy's control is the beer and wine for later this evening. So all I implore you to do is take good care of Kathy on the way to the hotel and help her get the beer and wine into the hotel, and we'll have it at the same place we did last year. And so have a good trip back to the hotel, and I'll see you in a little while. I think you're looking for some
Thank you for being here. I'm a director here at the center, and my father was born in Sweden. Oh, very good.